Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to continue this series of podcasts about just imagining how we get to a wilder, um, more integrated healthcare system. And I think that story and ritual are a really big part of it that obviously aren't a part of our healthcare system at all right now. And so I'm thrilled to invite Stephanie Mackay to chat with us today about the role of story and ritual in well-being, and also just kind of what we as North American white people often misunderstand about story and its role in our lives and its role in our culture. Um, and I've been following Stephanie's work for a while now, through a variety of podcasts and hearing her tell some really beautiful stories. And she was the one I know I wrote about this a while ago about, she was the one who kind of introduced me to the concept of how iron, um, if we're not in good relationship with iron, if we're not making offerings in exchange for using iron, that it will take its offerings back, sometimes through violence, and that's part of why we see these iron-based tools being used for such violence in our world today. And that totally blew my mind and has made me really excited and enthusiastic to follow Stephanie's work since then. Um, she has these really awesome story. I don't even know how to describe it, Stephanie, but the storytelling groups that you have where you kind of do these deep dives and break down the things that people get hung up with or angry about or confused by in stories, and really helps us to kind of find those seeds of our old culture within stories. And so, Stephanie, please feel free to share anything else about your background that you'd like to, but I'd also love to hear like how you came upon story and ritual and how it's become such a large role in your vocation and your work in the world.
Thanks, Amy. It's really good to be here. I I think that early on, I did a degree in literature, and I think I saw beautiful things in the stories, but didn't actually find an academic world that supported some of the deeper stirrings that I was feeling when I was reading the stories. And I did a major detour from my life after university and went into video and video art and video production, media arts, etc. And somewhere along the line in that, I had a lightning bolt moment that I was going in the wrong direction and found my way to Martine Prechtel's school, Bolet's Kitchen. And it was really through studying with Martine that I came to understand or step into, live within the immensity that stories actually are, and to see the profound beauty in them and what they're actually carrying. And from there, it just had a very organic unfolding of story, just seemed to claim me. And I said yes. And I have said yes over and over again, and my life has dramatically changed because of it.
Are you willing to tell us kind of how your life changed because of kind of following story and
Sure. I'll also just add that's also where ritual really came into my life, is
Hmm.
through studying with Martine. I think, the big part of it was coming into Bolet's Kitchen, Martine's school. I was maybe 10 years into my video career, living in the heart of Montreal, in the city, spending most of my time in front of the computer, which was a major, as I said, major detour in my life. Prior to that, I was very immersed in land and um, culture, and then went through a significant loss and grief, and that's how I turned away from that and went into the world of video, which has benefited my life in amazing ways. But I came in really feeling an immense amount of despair around the state of the world, the human condition, where we were at, what was happening politically, globally. I wasn't able to see the beauty in my own ancestry. I tried reading the stories and they all just felt oppressive and violent and misogynist, and I couldn't see the beauty. And so I was very shut down, really, and full of despair. And so stepping into this world of beauty with Martine changed all of that. And it became impossible for me to continue my video career. I left everything after, I guess, a couple years of studying with Martine. And, my whole focus in life came back to land, culture, and, the holy connection, relational interdependence, the web, beauty, ancestry, ceremony, all of this. So there was this very significant reorientation and also a very significant shedding and falling away, which is devastating. It was devastating. And yet from that devastation came this immense rebuilding of a life that's brought me here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's really inspiring. I think that that's one of the reasons I really wanted to interview people is because I think that a lot of people have this deep longing for something different in their lives, and in this modern world, it's really hard to see the paths to get there. And so, hearing people's personal experiences with it, I think, kind of helps lay down the breadcrumbs of the path to follow. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And it's all right there. That's the thing that's so continually amazing to me is that it's all right there. And yet we live within this field of the dominant culture that is constantly wanting us to turn away from it or to forget or remain within this cultural amnesia. And when we find like-minded folks and groups and teachers and community where we can um, have this vision to see, it's incredibly nourishing and for many can be life-saving.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was just listening yesterday actually to Megan Watterson. She's a feminist Christian theologian, and she was just talking about the Gospels of Mary Magdalene and the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and and just kind of how Empire sort of declared that those stories were of doubtful authenticity
Hmm.
because they were so anti-imperial in what they were kind of where they were saying sort of the origin of authority and the origin of the divine comes from. And it feels that way with kind of our folk tales and our mythology as well, that sort of the threatening parts of it were kind of denatured and sometimes, as you said before, kind of necessarily shape-shifting to be able to continue to exist, really. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you mentioned in your story too, kind of when you first encountered a lot of folklore and mythological stories that they just kind of felt yucky to encounter them. I definitely felt that way. I took Tad's class about Sleeping Beauty last winter, and I remember being like, oh, Sleeping Beauty, like it just feels like such patriarchal mush. And I'm gonna take this class because I think Tad's cool. But I feel like we could, and then you deep dive into it and you're like, oh, this means like the total
Yeah.
opposite of what I thought that it meant. And so I was kind of wondering, like, what do people who have kind of only encountered either like the Disney-fied stories or the feminist retellings of stories or that urge to tell stories in that way, like what are we missing? What are we misunderstanding about what's contained in these stories?
Great question. I think what you described is evidence that empire has succeeded because what empire wants to do, or what imperialism wants to do, or has done and continues to do, is takes what is beautiful and sacred to the peoples that they're oppressing, flips it upside down and demonizes it, or makes it ugly, or makes it small, or trivializes it, or whatever. So the fact that we come to our stories and we look at them and we think, oh, this is awful, this is patriarchy, this is oppression, this is, whatever. That's because we're all conditioned. And I don't say that as any sort of criticism on any of us, but we are simply conditioned because we've grown up in empire. We have that lens. So the first thing, and really the easiest thing we can do, is come to these stories, look where we're upset about whatever is in the story, and flip it upside down to say, if Sleeping Beauty doesn't have agency, let's just flip it upside down. And can we possibly look at how she might have agency, or how this whole thing might be a beautiful thread to bring her into her initiation, her flowering, her gift as the land blossoming again in spring, etc.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. The the threads that you pull, like even just listening a week or two ago with Finis the Falcon, and yeah, like beforehand I was kind of reflecting on like what are the things that really bug me, and I was like, oh, this story doesn't really bug me that much. But then as you were discussing it, and you're like, okay, really, what did you think about the sisters? I was like, oh yeah, I did kind of think that they were a real bummer and really superficial and materialistic, and then yeah, you were talking about the weaving and connecting it to all these other stories of grandmother weaving the world and the fates, and and I think that part of it is our own sort of literacy of these stories, right? Of like, I think that our ancestors would have had sort of this bigger library of stories that they carried, that they could kind of say, oh, this is kind of pulling in this from this story and this from this story. And um, whereas we're kind of like seeing these stories often in isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So all of these stories are embedded within a greater cultural matrix of stories, and all of the stories are related. And so now many of the stories have been forgotten, or they've been severed from each other. And so we're only, Finis the Falcon is clearly a part, is the feather of Finis the Falcon is clearly a part of a greater web of stories. And yet, you know, and actually it comes to us through collections of Russian fairy tales, even though it far predates Russia as an entity. But actually the Russian collections are some of the more comprehensive collections that we can find out there. Actually, a lot of Russia, what we now call Russia, has maintained a significant level of so-called pagan practices and beliefs, and their stories. However, they are still severed from each other, and we don't have this whole very complex web of a cultural understanding and a cultural holding by the stories. So the stories actually are a part of what holds the community and the culture. And then we move through it and we feed that holding through our ritual remembrance of the stories. So another way to look at this is, yes, to remember that they've been severed. If we're coming to the stories and we're feeling, oh, I'm not really digging this. Why is it like this? Why is it like that? So there's that. But then also there's the layers, as you just briefly mentioned a minute ago, that all of these stories have had to shift and change in order to survive. So they've taken on layers of the dominant culture, whatever that was at a particular time. They've taken that layer on, in order to survive. So then when we read it, we see that layer and there's, we're coming possibly with the hopes of something different from the oppressive cultures. And but we see it and then we think, oh, well, that's just what the story is. That's not what the story is. That's what the story has very brilliantly done to survive and be here with us now, because these stories are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old and they're still here. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So then we look at where our prejudices are in the story, like in the story of Phineas the Falcon, where there's the two older sisters and, they're asking for, what we may consider to be vain requests from their father who's going to the market and saying, what gifts can I bring you? And they just ask for clothes and gold and satin shoes and petticoats and all this stuff. But so we have a prejudice. I have a prejudice. There's a part of me that had a prejudice around that. Thankfully, I can see that there's something more going on. And so I look at that prejudice and say, oh, I have a prejudice here. What else can I learn? So let's start looking into this. What is the, spiritual function of a petticoat? What actually is brocade? What is, what is gold within ceremony? Why is gold always so important? We look into these pieces more deeply, and all of a sudden we start to see the prejudice falls away and the beauty of the story is lifted up.
Hmm. Well, and what you were talking about too, as far as like the silk petticoats and the brocade, um, I feel like in the times when these stories were really told routinely and like more of a handmade life, people just have more of an understanding of what goes into the crafting of those things, and it doesn't feel as materialistic, right? It's like this is art, really, and uh
Yeah.
yeah, I heard someone oh, I heard Stephen Jenkinson, I think it was, talking about this recently, of like it's kind of a gift now because we don't know sort of what goes into the crafting of something. It's like unless you know how much like it's like all you really know is like how much it costs to purchase it now.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that kind of almost like automatically shifts you into that more
Yeah,
material realm or
for sure.
transactional. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the sisters, they were asking for all of those things because they were, you know, sewing and, designing their own clothing, and that's a beautiful thing. And of course, yeah, they would also know what actually goes into making brocade. Brocade is a very beautiful and fine art. And then, of course, there's the spiritual understanding of each one of these things. And at that time, or, at the origins, and for many of the thousands of years that this story existed, of course, it would not always have been a petticoat or some brocade. But whatever it is, there would be the understanding that all of our layers of clothing have a spiritual significance. So this comes from a people's an intact time, um, and has also journeyed through that time when clothing still had a spiritual significance. It wasn't just functional or um, adornment. It was each layer, each piece of clothing, however you wore it, whatever was embroidered on it, how it hung on your body, all of these things, what time of year you wore it, they all had spiritual significance.
Yeah, I think that's a great. Well, I guess I have two questions. Maybe I'll start with the one that's still more story connected than the ritual one. You mentioned earlier just kind of talking about what these stories hold as far as culture. I forget exactly how you put it, but I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about like, yeah, what's kind of contain what it's holding up for us and like what it's containing. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
Yeah, for sure. So I understand stories as seed jars. So for those of us who, have some understanding or awareness of seed saving, that's how I understand stories, at least now. Um, but I mean, seed saving has been going on for millennia. Um, and there's, beautiful handcrafted seed jars that keep the seeds. And the stories are cultural seed savers. They actually hold the seeds of culture within them. And right now, what I think they're doing is they're waiting for a time within which the conditions are appropriate for those seeds to sprout and regrow a culture worth living for. So that's part of what they're holding for us right now. Since their beginning, the understanding that I hold is that stories are the land. They're not about human lives, although that layer can be there, but they hold our relationship and our agreements with the land, with the holy in nature, and are the essentially as the agreements, they are what shape and craft our day-to-day and seasonal lived culture. So, and then within that, they hold the teachings around that culture. So, growing up, a child may not know that brocade is woven and that weaving is weaving the world into being, and that all of the beings that are woven into the brocade, what we would call symbols, are actual beings that are being woven into this world. It's the other world being woven into this world. There are living beings, just as the stories are living beings, but they would know the story. And then as they go through initiation or certain ceremonies, then that teaching would be passed on to them. So it's this beautiful container, this beautiful holding of the spiritual teachings of a people, of a community. It's also the seasonal unfolding of the land. It's how we understand what's happening, the relationship between the stars and the ocean, the relationship between the rains and, the plants. All of this is held within the stories. And they're all held within, at least 5 or 6 layers of the story. So we can, and the human layer is a part of that. So that's one layer. But then there's all these other layers that are the rich tapestry of human culture in relationship with the holy in nature.
I love too that there's sort of like certain aspects of the story that you have to like grow into having the capacity to carry that. I think a lot of our modern I remember literally thinking when I was 18 years old that I had sort of the intellectual capability to understand anything that I would need to understand in life at that point, which 25 years on, I'm like, that was insane. But like at the time, I was like, oh yeah, I got this. Which I think is kind of a natural hubris of late adolescence. But like, you don't have the elders to kind of like
Yeah,
uh help to humble you in that process.
sure.
Yeah.
But I imagine, Amy, and I don't know your life story, but I imagine life humbled you in its own way.
Yeah.
Am I
Yeah,
right?
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't worry, all these 18-year-olds with their, arrogance, they'll be humbled. It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that just sort of that cultural expectation that there are things that you have to like build up to is a it doesn't feel like a very at least a very United States cultural concept right now. Like it's sort of like I want it all and I want it now kind of um
Yeah, and I think that is, part of the immediate gratification culture that we
mhm.
have, that we don't have to work towards anything. That I think there's also a layer of entitlement in that, and yeah, elders certainly would help in that if we still had an intact culture of elders. Um, of course, if we had an intact culture of elders, then we would most likely have an intact culture of initiation. And so all of that would be in place so that maybe the devastations that life dishes out in the absence of those might be, I would not say less devastating, but held with a deeper understanding and actually
Mm.
held within community, within the village, within that web of culture. So we might not be quite so devastatingly alone in it.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah. There are a couple of things I was wondering about from what you were saying earlier. I'm going to ask them both now, and I can ask the second one again later, if it gets lost. But um, the first thing I was wondering about is like, is it uniquely kind of these folk tales that can hold these aspects of culture, or are the stories that we absorb now in more like popular media, like television um, or novels or whatever it is, are they kind of like shaping what our culture holds? Holds now. And then the other question I had is with these stories, um, kind of like almost like communicating for the land, if I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but like how do you hold these European stories and kind of these stories of our lineage with kind of being on this different land, and like how do you I don't know, how do you weave together the tapestry of kind of the North American stories with the European stories kind of within
Mm.
us and kind of helping to craft that
Yeah,
next healthy culture?
great question. Okay, can you ask the first one again?
Yeah, so the first one was like, is it like, does it have to be folk tales and mythology that are
Right.
kind of carrying these cultural things, or are we
Yeah.
sort of shaping a new, like, are the
Yeah.
other forms of media kind of shaping our culture in that
Right.
way as well? Yeah.
Okay. Well, since you asked that question, I think we would have to differentiate between uh, culture and non-culture. And so essentially what I think we're living in right now is actually a non-culture.
Mm.
We've lost culture or, yeah, it's not culture as it's been understood for millennia up until, the past maybe few hundred years or thousand years or whatever. We don't have to get too specific on it. But that culture is specifically the manifestation of our relationship with the holy or with the sacred, with that gives us life every day. And I spoke a little bit just briefly about the agreements. So there are agreements with the holy, with the land that says we will, and this is in the stories. It's the stories where there's marriage, which is so many of them. It's actually a marriage to the holy. And the story itself is the agreements that we are asked to uphold or remember in order to maintain that marriage. So, what does that mean? It means we're constantly taking from the land. We cannot live without taking from the land. There are different ways to take from the land that are less impactful than others, but we're in a very heavy place of taking from the land right now without reciprocity. So maybe a more easier way to understand it is that it's reciprocity. It's that we take from the land, then what is asked of us in order to give back? Because every time we take from the land, there is something that is removed. There is a void that needs to be addressed. And so the human culture is we take from the land. There's a marriage with that particular being, let's just say with the deer or with the mountain goat or, with the salmon or with a particular plant, with the corn, with the millet or the barley. There is a marriage that happens with that holy being. In that marriage is actually not that different than how marriage happens between two people, where we have our vows, we have our agreements. This is what I agree to do in order to uphold my part of this relationship. So the holy, the land, is upholding their part by keeping us alive every day. What are we doing to uphold our part? Again, culture is that upholding where we embroider our clothes in a certain way. We embroider our clothes with, again, the quote unquote symbols, but they're not actually symbols, the actual beings, with the particular plant. Then we put that embroidery on our clothing with which has again its all own spiritual understanding. Then when we move through our day, we're constantly moving through the embodiment of that story or of that agreement. The agreement to cook the food a certain way, to to arrange the bones a certain way afterwards, to adorn our, ladles with certain, you know, um, again, symbols that are not symbols with the beings that we're in relationship with, to sing certain songs when we're cooking the food. All of this, which is what we would call culture, is actually us participating in our agreements with the holy in response for the life that we receive every day. That is not what we're involved in right now. So, that being said, can the holy speak to us through our current non-culture or through media or through stories, through movies, through songs? Absolutely. So the holy, I've experienced it so many times where, I won't go into it, but where I could be, watching some show and it's, a show that's been created recently and whatever, and there's an incredible connection between my soul path, between my agreements with the holy that is, that I receive through that particular media. So absolutely, the holy can still communicate with us through our current forms of media. Is that a culture? No, I would say no.
Yeah. I I find as you speak about those things of kind of like the ornamentation of the ladle and the embroidery, like part of me is like this deep longing for it, and part of it is like this, oh my God, that would take forever. How could you ever do it, you know? And just that tension, and it makes me think about sort of like what, you know, sort of like the violence that happened in our past that just makes us feel like we can't slow down for those things that are really like the most important things in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also if you look at it, in an intact culture, those ladles are passed down from generation to generation. And, if a ladle wears out, then yes, somebody makes a new ladle and there's an understanding of how to make it and all this stuff. And there's a constant, regeneration within the household, within the community. But, you have one sweater that you wear possibly for your whole life, or, you have this one ladle that you use. So you're not needing to make everything from
Mm.
scratch. You're not needing to say, okay, now I need to create a whole culture around me, just me by myself. It's
Hmm.
impossible. And yet, Martine always says, attempt to do the impossible because along the way you'll do something magnificent.
Mm.
So, just even if you had just one ladle, make one ladle and then That's it. And every time use that ladle, you remembered the wood, where it came from, the story of the land, the peoples of the land. Maybe you did some research on embroidery from your ancestry and then put those beings, on the ladle, and you could remember who they are, that they're barley and, a scythe and, the god of grain, all of these things. You just make one ladle. We
Mm,
just have to make it accessible for us. Make an effort for sure, but make it accessible and know that what we're doing, if you make one ladle that the whole story of and is adorned in this way, that may be the seed for the next generation to make something more and then more
mm,
and then more. So this is not for our own time. It's
mhm,
impossible. We can't regenerate a culture in one lifetime. But doing something small and accessible is a big and magnificent thing.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm imagining embroidering little nettle leaves on things now.
Yes, I love it.
Um, yeah. Well, let's um maybe circle back to that other question of just holding these European stories on North American land and like how you walk with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, great. So for me, and one of the main reasons why I do this is because I recognize the importance of reconciliation or anti-colonial work, anti-colonial movement. The, I think the only way we can truly do that is as people of European descent is to rehydrate our umbilical cord to our roots, to our ancestry, to our origins, so that we can come to the table of reconciliation with something to offer, with a soul that is deeply rooted in something beautiful. And so I don't think that, or I think that we can hold the, and I say ancestry, and that can be fairly broad. We have, if you're of European descent, you likely have a whole mixture of ancestries. And then there's also, the ancestries that could be, I mean, it gets very wild, and that's maybe another conversation. But if there is a particular European culture that you're incredibly drawn to, I say just go for it. Learn the stories of those people. Even if you're not 100% sure of a direct DNA, ancestry connection. Um, of course, being aware of appropriation, etc. But there are good ways to do that. Um, then holding those stories, we can then come to, the land where we are currently living and hold the stories, hold the culture in a very different way than if we hadn't done that cultural work ourselves with our own ancestry. Um, and I think it's incredibly beautiful to actually see as we are deeply steeped in our own stories, and then when we come to our stories here, that we have a shared language, that there is actually similarities. I remember I was working with Blackfoot elder Randy Bottle in Alberta when I was there for a while. And I had been studying the two brothers, the Grimm fairy tale, the two brothers. And I was telling him about this story. And he was blown away at how similar some of the elements were to one of his stories from the Blackfoot Nation. So, and then there's a story from what's now Moldova, and it has a sequence in it, so part of the bones of that story that is almost identical to the story that Martine has shared with us, the toe bone and the tooth. So, of course, being very careful and aware of cultural appropriation, but if we can do our work and really um, you know, grow some memory or capacity with our own ancestry, we can then come to the stories and the culture of this land without that immense spiritual hunger that causes appropriation. And so I think in that we have a much greater capacity to truly honor the stories and the culture of the people whose lands we're living on. And read the stories from the people whose land you're living on, but also read the stories of your own people.
Do you say a little bit more about that spiritual hunger and what that looks like how you see that showing up in the world?
Yeah, sure. I mean, how it shows up in the world is what we're all living in. This dominant culture is how it shows up. But being severed from our spiritual and cultural origins and ancestral origins, um, I mean, this is a big topic. We could do several conversations about just this. But, a lot of the migrations of peoples um, in the last 2000 years has been because of a fleeing from grief, a fleeing from oppression, from another dominant force. So Europe has gone through successive waves of colonization. Each wave pushes people further and further and further. Each wave creates a greater well of grief that has not been addressed. So that unaddressed grief becomes so big that the peoples actually are not able to hold it, and but grief requires motion, and so that motion gets translated into fleeing, moving away from it. So we then come, here to Turtle Island, and our ancestors um, were carrying this, immense turning away from grief. When we turn away from that grief, we're also left with, yeah, this severance from the ceremony, severance from the holy, severance from our culture. And that creates a huge void. And that void is hungry.
Mm.
And um, that void is also there, or that hunger is also there because of all of our ancestors that were not properly grieved,
Mhm.
that, we didn't have the capacity to, sing them or weep them to the other side. So there's this ancestral hunger. They basically, yeah, this ancestral hunger that's there. We are the recipients of that as the descendants of these people. And we then also carry that fleeing away from grief. Um, so that void that is there, the cultural, spiritual void, the fleeing away from grief, that creates this immense hunger in us. And I mean, that's a very complicated way of saying we actually just deeply long for being held in an intact culture,
Mhm.
the culture that holds us, the spiritual web that holds us. It's, for most of the existence of human beings, we have lived within that. And so it's only actually fairly recently that we have been lifted out of that. The memory of that is still in us and we long for it. So that the longing mixed with the spiritual hunger, when we see other cultures that have some resemblance of being intact, of course, there's immense devastation for Indigenous peoples around the world at this point. and yet they're holding something that the, you know, old European ancestry, the longing that we have for that, sees it and says, oh, that has the flavor of what I'm actually longing for, what I'm desperately hungry for. And so I want to go and take that. That's how we get essentially what we have now. We get, capitalism, consumerism, imperialism, and the devastation of the indigenous people. That hunger, rather than essentially exporting it on other people, if we hold it and look at our own ancestry, remember our stories, our songs, our food, our clothing, as best we can, our ceremonies, our rituals, that longing, that hunger within us actually is addressed, gets met, and we stop needing to take and consume from others.
Yeah. Yeah, what I was just thinking of now is just like, yeah, just this grief that has never been faced, and how grief has almost been like villainized, I think, in some
Yeah.
aspects of modern culture. I I think if I were to describe my own personal religious beliefs, I'm an animist Catholic, and so I go to Mass, and there's definitely sometimes some tension there. And this past week, the person was giving a homily and basically was talking about two different funerals and how at one of the funerals the people were really just like crying and sobbing and and he made it sound like that was bad, that that was a lack of faith that that person was going to go on to heaven. And
Right.
that and then this other funeral where everyone was just kind of like more stoic. And so it was really interesting to talk to my daughters about that after mass and just how like I know for sure in like some West African cultures that I know a little bit about, but also in Irish culture as well, right? That the the tears, the lamenting is part of how the souls of our lost ones get to where they're going, And so it was just, I don't know, I just felt this like kind of like no, you're wrong, this isn't how it is, kind of in response to that. And
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's for all of old Europe, the tears and the wailing, the keening, was so important, as you say, because our tears are actually the canoe or the vessel on which our ancestors journey across to the shore of stars, is what Martine says. So we have to grieve. We have to grieve in order to carry our loved ones to the other side so that they can be ancestors. Because if we're really getting technical about it, they're not actually ancestors until they've made it to the other side. So we need to grieve. And I mean, the other layer of it is that grief is an essential part of our feeding of the holy, that our capacity to grieve, to metabolize loss, as we metabolize loss through, and grief, we have this immense capacity to create beauty. And beauty is what we feed the holy with. And so I mean, grief is an essential part of the spiritual matrix and an intact human culture.
yeah, oh shoot, I lost the thread of what I was thinking about there. Um, oh, that's what it was. I was wondering, I don't know if there's actually a link here. It seems like there's a link in my mind between sort of this running from grief and running from very real violence, and um, kind of this urge to save the world, this like kind of this more salvation mindset, or like that, yeah, that we are the ones that need to fix what's broken in the world. And I wonder if you see that as a real linkage there, or yeah.
Yeah. I love this question. And it just makes me think of, one of the things that I love Martine would say. He'd say, you all think that you need to save the ocean. He said, leave the ocean alone. Go and save yourself. He's like, I think, yes, I think there's this, yeah, of course, it comes from a very beautiful place that we want to try and save the world. Um, and I do think that there is um, yeah, there's actually something else that needs to be addressed, and it's coming out in that way. And I think, we could look at it as, many of the colonizers actually thought that what they were doing was really amazing and that they were saving people, which is, you know, I mean, I can hold that. I can hold that they actually thought that they were, working from their deepest part in their heart, that they were trying to save people. Of course, that caused immense devastation and horrific atrocities. But this outward push to save something is actually bypassing what needs to happen internally in our and within our own communities and culturally. If we restored or regenerated our capacity to grieve and hold ceremony and to address the immense spiritual debt that we have because of losing the agreements, if that's what we did, our culture would just, or the non-culture, the dominant culture, however we want to phrase it, would itself dramatically change without having to look outwards to try and save something else. Nothing would need to be saved because we would have changed the holding, the core, and the ripple effect of that would be that the land, the planet, the oceans, the forests, the rivers, the animals, they would all be quote unquote saved because we would have a dramatically different relationship with them. What we're trying to do is save without changing the relationship. And we're just trying to coordinate. We're going to save you and put you in this little box because you're saved, but that's losing the whole relational piece, that this river that we're trying to save, please keep trying to save rivers 100%. I'm not saying to, stop that. There's a place for that, but there's this whole other piece that we need in addition, recognizing that that river is a part of a whole web of the earth, of ecosystems, and that we cannot make our natural world a museum, cannot be severed from the whole thing. So let's come back to rebuilding our relational understanding of reciprocity, of the agreements. And then, yeah, we won't need to save the rivers. It will just be our relational way of being in contact with them.
Mhm. Yeah, it makes me think of just like the huge contingent of people who feel like, oh, the solution to climate change is technological innovation, and we're gonna dig up all of these things to make solar cells to, and it's like, or we could just consume less. It's like there are some people who are just like, no, it's not possible to get people to consume less. So we're just going to have to innovate our way out of this, which ultimately often leads us to consuming more things that we have less understanding of the impact
Yeah,
of.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Um, where do you think that we start with paying back these debts? Is it just kind of like really understanding these stories and kind of revivifying these rituals, or is like I don't know, sort of like the I'm always a little bit too fixated on like, okay, but how do we really do this? So
Yeah, I mean it's great to have that question and to live into it. Um, I'll just say that the debt cannot be paid back.
mm,
It's we are forever in debt.
mm,
There's no way of not being in debt. It's actually this very beautiful understanding. Imperialism holds that, okay, we have a debt and then we pay it back and then we're free.
mhm,
Whereas a more relational, intact, culture holds that we always want to be in mutual indebtedness. This Martine talks about this a lot, this mutual indebtedness, where because it means that we always have to be in relationship with each
mm,
other. So if we pay back our debt to the holy, well, first of all, we just can't. But let's just hypothesize that we could, then we're not in relationship anymore.
mm,
So it's actually embedded in the whole system, if we could call it that we can never get out of it because we have to stay in relationship. So what it is we just address the debt. So how do we address this debt? There's absolutely things that we can start doing. And many people are doing these. Like I said, one thing is if you made a ladle and remember songs, remember, all of the things that we've been talking about, a part of that is a part of addressing the debt. Um, because addressing the debt is not sort of like a one-time, okay, now here I've given you some offerings. It's a whole way of life. So that if you sing a particular song that is related to barley when you're making your barley soup, that's addressing the debt
mm,
because addressing the debt is remembering. So remembering is actually feeding the holy. So when
mm,
we remember the holy, when we remember the beings who we're in relationship with, that's feeding them. And so that's addressing the debt. So learning the stories, coming to a mythology club, whatever, going to your local story group or whatever, you know, remembering our ancestral stories, remembering our ancestral songs, learning an ancestral language, embroidery, weaving, making beauty with our hands, all of these things are remembering. And so, and yes, of course, there are seasonal rituals that happen or seasonal ceremonies that are a big part of the remembering. And in that, we give gifts, make beauty with your hands, and go out onto the land and give gifts to, the ones that sustain your life. If you eat meat, give gifts to the, animals. If you're, whatever, vegan, vegetarian, gives gifts to the plants that sustain you. If you're an omnivore, give gifts to all of the beings that, support you. To your home, it's like giving gifts is a huge part of addressing the debt. But it's not just that. We can address the debt through our daily living of remembering.
yeah. And so that's basically what ritual in an intact culture is. Yeah. Yeah, that's going to stick with me for a long time. I think in part because I'm just like, just recognizing sort of myself swimming in that fishbowl of, oh yeah, I've got to get square here.
Yeah,
And yeah.
yeah.
Um, and I remember reading somewhere, I think it was like an interview with Martine about um, him talking about like, that people a lot of times indigenous people are building their houses out of less durable materials,
Yes.
and either intentionally or a side effect of that is that relationality of continuing to work together to tend and maintain that.
Yeah.
Um, and that the I think he said it as like, so now the houses last, but the relationships don't. And it was so interesting to me because I think a lot of times that was part of what colonizers were seeing that made them think that these people needed to be saved was like, oh, they're using these shoddy materials
Totally.
uh, and not understanding, that there may be a different type of intentionality to it. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And that's a great example of seeing something on the surface, like, oh gosh, their houses are always falling apart and they're always needing to, repair them. That's what they're seeing. But what they're not seeing is the whole web of relationship that stewards, and also the whole spiritual understanding that is a part of the home, because the home is a whole spiritual sacred house unto itself. There's all the materials that are used. There's it's immense, and it of course varies depending on the people, but that is part of, yeah, the seasonal, or every few years ritual of renewal. And I think that's what we've imperialism has really lost, is this ritual of renewal. Whereas what we want to do is there's no renewal. We just want to keep going forward, or we want to freeze things. We want to have a house that lasts forever and we never have to, fix it. We want to be efficient, whereas a ritual of renewal is not efficient, but it's incredibly spiritually and relationally valuable and rich.
Yeah, I think you see that even in like how states and nations create their budgets and things like that, of just like, ooh, we want to build new, build new, build new, but never circle back to maintain and renew.
Yes,
And yeah.
for
And then
sure.
of course within households and lower layers of
Yeah.
societal structures too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what we're actually getting to now is that our products are actually not meant to last. And so we're not only do we have, they're not meant to last anymore. The so we're losing that so-called durability, and we've already lost the understanding of renewal. So it's just amping up our consumerism even more,
Hmm.
which is, expanding our, spiritual debt to the holy and to the land even more.
Hmm.
So it's quite scary.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of gone from like renewal to durability to disposability.
Exactly.
Um, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Kind of a haunting concept when you reflect upon it for too long.
A little bit. Yeah. And we can, we can still remember, and we can even, and when we don't know, like let's say, when I go and I fill my car with gas, I remember the oil. I remember, the beings as best I can that died and went through this whole process to make this oil. And I remember that I don't know where they came from. I remember that I don't know so much about them. I don't know the whole path that they've gone. And just in that, there's a small, tiny bit of feeding that happens.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think even that remembering changes your relationship to your car and to the gas and how you decide which trips you take where. And
It hugely changes your relationship. Yeah. Yeah, I remember in session, Martine would, he'd say to all of us, we'd all arrive in the morning and we had to, arrive in our cars. And he said, I see you all come in with so much disdain for your cars. And he's like, but they're magnificent beings. That those metals, those whatever, the rubbers, they didn't ask to be put into that shape. And remember where they came from and remember who they are, that they're this magnificent part of the holy in nature. And it completely changes our relationship. And I think there is a tendency, in these more land-based communities, that are doing amazing things right now. But there's also this tendency to be like, oh, I don't want to look at my car. I don't like, my car or whatever. And yet, in that turning away from, that's the same turning away that our ancestors did when,
Mm.
they immigrated here. So we can see it still showing up in small ways in our own lives. It takes an immense amount of courage and capacity to turn towards and actually feel the grief of our cars and to love them and to know that they didn't ask to be put into that shape and that they're made up of these magnificent beings that are a part of the holy in nature. And same with our computers and everything. So it's all there.
Yeah.
And yeah, it makes a big difference when we start to remember that we've forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this might sound a little silly or a little flippant compared to what you're saying, but like I have been initiated into this West African style of stick divination, and it was kind of cool because like um in like learning that that was something I was supposed to do, the person that was doing the divination was like, so they want you to do this, but the reason they want you to do this is so that you sort of develop eyes to see and ears to hear your own ancestral traditions, which was a
Yeah.
really great reminder. But anyway, I was doing a divination for a friend, and one of the things that came through really strongly was those Peeps candies. And I just like, I don't know if you guys have those in Canada, but they're these like little marshmallow bunnies or chicks that are like dipped in sugar that's like neon. Um, so they're like big Easter candies here. Um, and they're just like the most unnatural commercialized kind of snack. So I was just really struck by it and just thought it was kind of funny that it came up when I was talking to my mentor about it afterwards and was like, "Oh, isn't this funny?" And he's like, "Well, you have to remember that there's an animate soul in everything, and just like even these things that you sort of disparage or neglect or and like you were saying of kind of thinking back to that of like, oh, the sugar cane that grew from this earth and where these dyes came from and all of those things that yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you want to, go even further with your feeding, is do research on sugarcane. How did sugarcane come to be in, its, agricultural form right now? What's the original form of sugarcane? Where is its origins? What are the different names of sugarcane in the different languages in the, colonial languages that have colonized, and then, if possible, in the native languages of where it's from. So then that's a remembering of sugarcane. And then by doing that, you're completely changing the impact of that one little sugar bunny.
Amazing. I'm going to just take a quick look at my questions to make sure kind of what are the most pressing ones that, oh, yes. Um, yeah. So one thing we've talked about this a little bit, but I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about the characters that we don't like in stories and kind of what they have to teach us.
Great question. So I always love when I hold a mythology gathering or mythology club, as I call it. And I tell the story, or we open up the story, and then one of the first things I ask is, what are you upset about in this story? Who do you not like? Who's And it's so great, people come forward, of course, with all of these, complaints or grievances with the story. And then I usually say, first of all, thank you for still coming, because, it's a little bit like you with Briar Rose. It's like, why this story? Why would we, and yet you still went, and then you came out with this completely different understanding of Briar Rose. So, there are these ones in the story that we don't like. And, um, there's reasons why we don't like them that are attached to the dominant culture of today. And it comes back to, yeah, what I was saying about prejudices. So, if we look at an easy one that most people know, if we look at Cinderella, and this element is actually very similar in the story we were talking about before of the feather of Phineas the Falcon. But if we look at Cinderella, since most people know it, she's got, the evil stepsisters and the evil stepmother. And, we don't like them. They're considered to be, the evil ones or the bad ones. And we hold that as a prejudice. One thing that we can look at first is that if there's a being or if there's something in the story that you don't like, just as if there's something in the story that you really like, that spot or that being in the story holds something for you, that there's something there. Again, if we don't like, these, evil stepsisters, let's turn that upside down and say, okay, what else is going on here? What could possibly be happening here? Um, the thing is that we want to have good and bad. We want to have, the black and white. And that's a very imperial holding of the story and the complexity of the story. And it's very modern to say, well, there's, the good and evil in the story. The evil stepsisters are evil, end of story. There's nothing more to really learn there. Um, these polarities exist in the natural world. We have to have polarities but what's happened with imperialism is that the polarities have become polarized. And so it's this or this, and there's nothing in between. When actually the purpose of the polarities is to hold the tension, to hold the far sides and to hold the tension so that all life can exist in between. So we look at the evil stepsisters, and the evil stepsisters are actually holding a really important piece in the layer of initiation that this story is, that is necessary for the unfolding of the whole story. So if we took those evil stepsisters out, we took the evil stepmother out, there would be no tension, and so the whole story would fall apart.
Mm.
The story itself, one is the land, but is also the story of female initiation. They're simultaneous, and it's a necessary part, or it's a necessary cycle for the regeneration of the seasons, for regeneration of the year, for the feeding of the holy. So if we take out the quote unquote evil stepsisters, then there's no renewal, there's no regeneration, and there's no feeding.
Mm.
So it's a big thing I was working with a group of adults a few weeks ago, and people were really upset about the evil man in the story. And I was like, okay, but let's look at it from this angle, and what does, his presence actually prompt to happen in the story? And what is he actually possibly protecting? And how is he, it was a big effort to shift our lens to see that he's actually necessary, that he's actually holding this layer that without everything would fall apart. we could say, well, but then aren't they just still evil? Who knows? I don't know. But what I know is that those sisters are an essential part of the initiation of their younger sister. And they're actually doing this in service to the holy. And the whole story is the web of initiation that is held by the whole village and has to happen. So um, we can look at these beings in the story that we don't like and maybe look at, how are they contributing to the movement of the story? The movement's necessary, so how are they contributing? And then also, what role might they have? And if we, and maybe just the question of what are they trying to protect or what are they in service to?
Mm.
And that shifts things quite significantly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if this is a question that it's even possible to answer, but something I'm wondering as you say that is just how people encountering these stories 1,000, 2,000 years ago would have felt about these characters if they too would have kind of been like, ooh, the bad guy, I don't like them, or if they would have had a different understanding of them. I don't know if you have a sense of that.
I mean, who knows? And I do think, we have become more and more polarized.
Mm.
So and with that polarization, we lose our capacity to hold complexity. And so I think 2000 years ago, even though, we're already 2000 years ago in many forms of, oppression and domination, I think that there was a much greater capacity to hold complexity.
Mm.
And when we hold complexity and when we hold that, oh, this is a necessary part, we don't demonize it. We don't say, oh, well, I don't like that. I don't want that. That's not a part of it. We say our whole relationship, our whole orientation to those ones changes. And we see, oh, this is a necessary part and it's not bad.
Mm.
Um, as the stories have come to us now, there is the word evil, evil stepsisters. We just take out that word and they're the stepsisters. There's a
Mm.
whole understanding of why they're stepsisters. How did they become stepsisters? It's all very, complex and yet there's a simple beauty to it that, well, all life needs to be there in order for life to happen.
Mm.
Um, and then I always do have the caveat when I'm teaching this is that this is not to say um, that we can just sit back and accept, violence and oppression and abuse and say, oh, well, it's not evil, it's just a part of the thing. I still want to say, like, don't, fight against oppression, fight against violence, or, hold your stance on that. Don't, maintain, an abusive situation when it's like, get yourself out when you need to get yourself out. I'm not advocating for that at all. This is something different. This holding that there is a complexity in the relational field of these stories and in the relational field of um, culture and the land.
Amazing.
Okay.
I feel like I could continue our conversation for hours and hours or like a multi-part conversation, but I also want to be respectful of your time too. Um, so uh maybe to wrap up, and this might be like asking you to pick a favorite child or a favorite plant or something like that, but do you have a favorite story right now that you'd be willing to pick just one and tell us why you love it?
It's so funny because every time I bring a new story to a mythology club or a myth gathering, I always say, "I this is my new favorite story because they're so amazing." I think, yeah, of course, I have some deep favorites, and I mean, yeah, I just want to say that the Feather of Phineas the Falcon is because that's what I'm currently with, so it's what currently my favorite. But Basil the Handsome and Leonora Goldenlocks
Mm,
is an amazing story. Um, The Stalker or The Widow's Son is got a different, it's a story from the Scottish Highlands.
mm.
It's also one of my favorites. Um, yeah, I mean, I could go on and on, but I, I'm definitely Basil the Handsome and Leonora Goldenlocks is staying with me,
What
for sure.
about that story is special to you?
It's one of the only stories that actually explicitly shows the dismemberment of initiation.
Mm,
It's got such a profoundly beautiful trajectory in the story, and it holds so many of the intact pieces, the vestiges. It holds
mm,
so many vestiges of an intact initiation and an intact cultural ceremony. So, the stories will, all of the stories that I bring hold vestiges of an intact culture. And those are the vestiges that are the cultural seeds that I'm hoping will, regrow at some point. But the stories hold varying degrees of these vestiges. And I just find that Basil the Handsome and Leonora Goldenlocks holds so many of the vestiges of an intact culture. And yeah, just an incredibly beautiful, amazing story.
wonderful. I'm gonna have to go look that one up
Oh
once we're
yeah.
done chatting. Is there anything else that feels really important to share or something that you wish I had asked that I didn't that you'd like to say before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I
Okay.
think I very much enjoyed my time with you, and I hope that, yeah, there's something of value in what I've shared, and yeah, maybe some inspiration. And yeah, I'm deeply in support of the work that you're doing, and the book that you're crafting and where you're going with it. And so, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that feels good to me.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share. And like I said, even personally, definitely have gotten some good nuggets of wisdom to carry along with me in my knapsack. So really appreciate your time and your wisdom and I'm so looking forward to Mythology Club on the 6th. So yeah, hopefully some other folks can join us there too. Um, Thanks again. This has been wonderful. And I'll stop our recording